Hi everybody. This video is going to be a summary of special objects. So these are objects which are useful to know about when you're making random maps, but it's not always super obvious why they're useful because generally speaking we want them to be invisible. So some of these objects are things I've used in previous videos, some are new, but I just thought it would be nice to have a nice video consolidating everything in a nice list. So let's get right to it. The first special object we're going to look at is object 278. So object 278 is a dead fish trap, and we will create that object and we will see what it does. Let's say set place for every player and find closest. So 278, the dead fish trap, is a 1x1 object which is centered on the tile, and it is a building which cannot be placed on top of other objects. So this object is not invisible, it has these little dead fish trap graphics, but generally it is useful for placing objects in restricted areas. So for example, if we wanted to place gold per player on the outside of this ring of shallows, we can try to do that. We can say create object gold, set place for every player, set Gaia object only, find the closest point that is placed on the terrain of normal grass instead of grass 2. And we can see that since this outside area is a restricted zone for placing golds, we were not able to place any gold per player. But if we were, instead of placing gold, we placed object 278 and used gold as a second object, we should be able to get around that restriction. And as we can see, since we were placing 278 as the base unit, that has no terrain restrictions, so there is no restricting it from being placed on top of or past this ring of shallows, and we can use gold as a second object to place it over here. So one more thing to note about object 278 is that if these dead fish trap graphics are undesirable to have in the game, there's a way to get around that. So the graphics normally last for 60 seconds, and that is controlled by this resource storage of corpse decay time. So if we ever wanted to use this object to take up space but not necessarily see the graphics, we can put a resource delta attribute, value -60, and so this should go away as soon as the game starts. And as we can see, since that resource storage was set to 0, the dead fish trap expires as soon as the game starts and no graphics will appear. Okay, so the next object we're going to take a look at is fairly similar. It's object 1291, which is similarly 1x1 and centered on the tile. The big difference, however, is that 1291 can be placed on top of other objects. So we'll get rid of this gold. So if I say I want object 1291, find the closest point to the player, we'll put a second object of flag A on here because it's normally invisible. We can see that the flag is within the boundary of the TC, so it was able to place on top of other objects. Now, it's important to know that if you ever use 1291 as a placeholder for a player object, this object is actually designed to be an object that keeps players alive. So normally if you would place 1291 for a player, that player would be unable to be defeated. But if we want to just use it as a placeholder, we can simply do effect amount set attribute of object 1291 atr hit points set the hit points to 0, and object 1291 will go away as soon as the game starts, and it won't have any effect on the game after that point. So the next object we'll take a look at is object 647. So 647 is basically a blank object that is centered off the tile, or basically on the intersection of tiles. It already has an HP of 0, so it goes away as soon as the game starts, but so this really isn't necessary. But it's probably one of the best objects in the game for just taking up space. So let's try and place object place 200 of object 647, find the closest point to the player. So we can zoom in and we can see that object 647 is centered on the intersection of tiles, and so it could be used for a placeholder if you wanted to center something off the grid like this, or you can just use it simply to take up space and comprise actor areas if you wanted. So let's just say I wanted to give the flags an actor area 10, actor area radius of 0. I can tell the javelina to avoid actor area number 10. And then the javelina is placed on the outside of that actor area. So this is kind of a way to make sort of circular min and max distances to players, since if you spawn a bunch of objects and say find closest, they kind of orient themselves in a circle around the player base, as opposed to min and max distance to players, which is always a square. So that's another use for it. But anyway, so the next object we're going to talk about is object number 837. And 837 is the only one on this list that has a predefined name, and that's just a map revealer. So instead of creating 647, we'll just create a map revealer. We'll put it, let's just say we wanted to reveal these relics in the middle. We can put an actor area around these relics like we have here, put some map revealers in those actor areas, say actor area to place in is number 1. And we can see that the relics are revealed because we placed object number 837 in those actor areas. Now, object 837 will maintain its visibility throughout the entire game, so this explored area lasts forever. And that is in contrast to the next object we're going to talk about, which is object number 112. So object 112 is similar to a map revealer, except its visibility is only temporary. So if I replace the map revealer with object 112, we can see that the area starts out explored, but then after 7 seconds, the visibility goes away, but the area is still explored. Now, that 7 seconds is controlled by this particular resource decay, which is corpse decay time, which has the value of 7. So if we want to change the duration that this object will grant visibility, we can apply a resource delta and increase that time accordingly. So let's just say we wanted it to last 20 seconds instead of 7 seconds. We just add 13. So if I put a resource delta of 13, we can see that the area is revealed, and then 7 seconds has gone by. The visibility has not yet gone away, and this area will maintain visibility until we get to 20 seconds, and that's controlled by the resource delta that we put in here. Okay, so the next object on the list that we're going to talk about is object 1613. So 1613 is a terrain blocker, which basically goes on a tile, takes up space, and prevents other solid objects from being placed on that tile. So let's try and take an example. Let's paste a bit of code in here. So if you don't know already, a lot of distance and spacing attributes, when referring to groups of objects, refers to the origin of the group, not necessarily every member of that particular group. So if we're looking at these gold mines here, we can see that this gold has an attribute of avoid forest zone 1. And we can see here that since the group is rather big, that not all of the individual members of the group are respecting that avoidance. So let me try and put something else in the script. So we will, before we place the gold, we'll place a bunch of objects 1613, and we will say place on forest zone. And we'll put a second object, flag A. So now, we can see that when we add that extra constraint in to block those tiles off completely, all of the individual members of each of these groups of gold have to avoid the forest by at least one tile. And we can see that over here. It's a bit more clear over here. This gold pile would likely have members in it touching the forest if not for those terrain blockers. Terrain blockers can also be used in a different way. First, let me change this around a little bit. Instead of place on forest zone, we'll say terrain to place on beach. So it's important to note that terrain blockers inherently have 0 HP, so they go away as soon as the game starts. So whatever obstruction they may be causing will not hinder us as soon as the game starts. And we could potentially change this behavior if we were to say effect amount set attribute for the terrain blocker attr hit points, and we set hit points to a value that is larger than 0. And we can see when we do that, the terrain blocker now has 1 HP, and its blockage will exist throughout the entirety of the game. So if you want some invisible object that will inherently block an area of the map and make it impassable, that is another way to use a terrain blocker. But it's important to know that a terrain blocker is not a kind of object that can be owned by a player. Let me try and say set place for every player, and we will see if that changes anything. So we can see that no flags ended up on the beach terrain because a terrain blocker is a terrain class object, which is one that cannot be owned by a player. All right, and then moving on to the next object, which is going to be object 1654. So we will generate object 1654 in the same place we generated object 1613. So object 1654, if we look in the Advanced Genie editor, is called resources. And when we check in the game, when we capture those units, we can see it gives us a resource trickle. Now, the fact that this object generates resources is not really why it makes it useful, because resource trickles can be given to players in different ways, which are a bit more straightforward. For example, you could just use a mod resource on any of these 230 to 233 resources to give a generic resource trickle, which isn't tied to any object. The reason that 1654 is a useful object is because it can block buildings. Importantly, if we look at 1654, it has no size on its own, but if we modify its size, attr radius 1 to be 0.5, and same with radius 2, now this object takes up 1 tile worth of space, and it can block buildings by existing on a particular tile. So normally we would be able to place a dock in these shallows, but since object 1654 is in the way, we are blocking the dock with that particular object. Now, still notice that we're still incurring a resource trickle, so that's one downside. And another downside is that even if these units were set to unconvertible Gaia objects, is that the AI would still be able to target and attack these objects even though they're invisible. But there is a way to get around that issue, and that is by upgrading it from a class 14 object. So if we filter by buildings, and we filter by class, see, an object like a bridge is a terrain class of object, and that cannot be captured by players, nor can it be targeted by players. So if we start out with a bridge, object 605, say effect amount, upgrade unit, we upgrade the bridge into object 1654, and we modify the attributes of the source unit. Instead of placing 1654, we place object 605. We can see that now that object 1654 is inheriting the terrain class from the bridge which we upgraded it from, we are no longer able to capture these Gaia objects, and then we would no longer be able to target them anyway. So that's a good way to get around that problem while still maintaining the properties of the fact that this object will still block buildings. And that brings us to the last special unit on our list, which is object number 94. So object number 94 is right over here. And no, I don't mean this javelina. I can't actually select object 94 unless I press the idle military hotkey and give it a control group. So what object 94 is basically an invisible infantry unit. So this is the only invisible unit that has an attack index. And we can see we can attack this boy here, and we can see we can actually do damage with this invisible unit. Now, the possibilities of this are kind of interesting. Maybe you want to have a map where you have some sort of spy unit where you can sneak up on your opponent and do damage. Or maybe you want to put some maybe you want to use it as a Gaia unit to have some sort of natural hazards in your map. Like if you pass by a certain area, you might take damage. Now, the biggest downside to this particular unit here is that if you do use it as a Gaia unit, the players will be able to fight back. And if you were intending it to be some sort of natural hazard, that's usually pretty undesirable. But unfortunately, that's a limitation that we have to live with for now, because as far as I know, there is no class of unit that we can upgrade from that is capable of attacking players while players are not able to attack back. But still interesting nonetheless. And I think that's about all these special objects that I wanted to cover in this video. So hopefully you guys have learned something here. So thanks everybody for watching, and I'll see you next time.